Hello and welcome to all of the UK200 member firms to this webinar on pricing in the current COVID pandemic. I'm Andy Poole, I'm the legal sector partner at Armstrong Watson, and with me today is Nigel Haddon. Nigel is a pricing consultant at Bircher Jennings. You may remember that we both appeared at last year's UK200 conference speaking on pricing in professional firms. And later this year, we're planning on having a series of UK200 only 2-day pricing masterclasses for you to come along and attend as well. In the meantime, we thought you'd find it quite helpful to have this webinar on pricing in professional firms, given the current issues that we're all being faced with right now. What I'm going to be doing is asking Nigel a series of questions for his views, his opinions, what he's seeing law firms doing in the current marketplace, a few hints and tips, and we're hoping that you'll find this useful. If you do need anything else on the back of this, obviously we're both here for you to be able to get in touch with us, and any way that we can help, then we certainly will do. So if we can kick things off, as I say, I'm going to ask a few questions of Nigel. I'm sure he'll say hello as he's going to be answering the first questions as well. I think we can see that for almost all law and accountancy firms, right now it is all very much about cash. So how can firms use pricing skills in order to be able to help with the cash collection? Nigel, over to you.
Well, hello Andy, and good morning everybody. Yeah, absolutely, it's all about cash, more so than I think ever, more so even than in the last crisis we all lived through, the GFC back in 2008 to 2013. So I think there are probably three aspects to this question that all involve an element of discounting. I think for law firms and accountancy firms, invoicing now, it's time to go back to that old tried and trusted method of offering clients an early payment discount with your invoice. I remember the accountants that I've retained for a number of years, all of their invoices to me used to have a less 1.5% for payment within 7 days option on the invoice. And I think that's time to bring that back as standard. And a figure around 1.5%, 2% is plenty. It's a sufficient discount to motivate clients to pay. I think 7 days is the right sort of window for that. So that's the way I would approach invoicing current matters, and you don't need to change the terms of your retainer to offer that as an option on the invoice. But there's also the question of that working capital that we're currently missing out on, namely our debtors. And I think there are a couple of approaches that I'd be suggesting there. That there's no rocket science to this. It's obvious and it's common sense, but it needs doing. It needs driving from the top in law firms. So looking at the aged debtors, those in the sort of 0 to 90 day bracket, what you might call current aged debtors, let's get our credit controllers or our fee earners onto those clients and say, if you pay this now, and now can be 48 hours, 72 hours, I'll give you a 2.5%, 3% discount on that figure. Bird in the hand at this stage rather than two in the bush. And I'd possibly even go further. For those that have slid into the doubtful debtors region, I don't know what your experience is, but I would say anything over 90 is heading to doubtful. Some would say 120 days. But those can be contacted and offered a slightly meatier discount, maybe as much as 4 or 5% for payment now. So those are the dimensions I'd be recommending in terms of cash collection.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with you on the age profile there. I think certainly the older a debt becomes, the more doubtful it becomes. And I would be getting worried about debts over 90 days, particularly given the issues that we're all faced with right now. And many of our clients will be faced with cash flow issues themselves as well. So what was a doubtful debt before becomes a very doubtful debt now, unless we take steps that you've just been describing. So a lot of that talks about the historic work we've already performed. What about pricing for new work?
Yeah, good one, Andy. And I'll be going to a theme here that I know you'll be warm to. I would say that for all new work, and you know, those that have worked with me know that I'm very keen on giving clients pricing options. I think every new matter now should include a pay up front, pay now option, slightly discounted from whatever other options are presented to the client. It all comes back to cash collection. But if we give our clients an incentive to pay now, a discount around that 2.5 to 5% bracket off the fee they might otherwise pay. It should be enough in a low interest, low inflation economy to motivate clients to pay now. And again, it's all about cash. And we both know of organisations that have used advanced payment options to go from industry standard lockup to negative lockup.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see you smiling now because, you know, that's the sort of thing that we do quite actively. So, you know, I'd echo those comments. You know, we quite regularly include, even in the good times, a discount for early payment. And it's interesting that you're looking there at the percentages, which when you talked earlier about the existing debt, pay now and you'll get a slight discount, maybe 1.5%. Where we're quoting for new work, we're talking in the region of 2.5 to 5%. And I agree with you. I think that does need to be higher because they're then making a conscious decision to make that choice. Whereas we'd already done the work, expecting to get a certain amount for the work we've already done, where we're chasing the money, should be a lower discount for pay now. So I would agree with all of that. And you're right, you take those and it becomes habit. Actually, this is one of the good habits we can take forward to help, even as we come out of this, then maintaining, going from high lockup to low lockup to hopefully negative lockup, which is entirely possible. And you know that we do that quite regularly, and that helps us in that regard. So I think I would agree on pricing new work there. If we're looking at specific areas of work and looking at where firms are busy and where firms are quiet right now, that pricing for new work might change slightly. I'm thinking firms may well be busy with employment matters right now, particularly around employees being made redundant or being furloughed, etc., or making wills, particularly on the legal side or in the accountancy side, looking at payroll matters, looking at furloughing, looking at cash flow, etc. Now, you could see that as a peak in demand, but we don't want to be seen as ambulance chasing. We don't want to be seen as going out and taking advantage and creating a bad reputation on us, which will stick after we come out of this issue. So I wonder what your views are there.
It's a really big question, that, Andy. First of all, let me echo something you were just saying there. I think one of the things that firms have to do is demonstrate pricing integrity. So the strategic approach, the policies they've had around pricing pre-COVID-19, they should be sticking to. And those that do indulge in profiteering, in what we call price gouging, I think the damage to their reputations will be severe, and it'll come back to bite them when all this passes. So I think we need to avoid at all costs profiteering, which means taking advantage of clients' needs when they are unable to switch to alternative providers. Now, there are many, many alternative providers for most of the things that law firms and accountancy firms take to market. But in the areas that you mentioned there, where professional service firms are incredibly busy at the moment, there is room for bringing the laws of supply and demand to the table and saying to clients, look, we're just incredibly busy in our restructuring team or our wills team at the moment, and we can't offer business as usual at business as usual prices simply because of demand. So firms will have to position themselves for really quite nuanced conversations with clients to justify modest, temporary increases in price. And if they don't have the skills to have those nuanced conversations, best not to look for that increase in price. The potential here for doing damage is enormous, and the potential upside for modest increases in those practice areas that are suffering from enjoying high levels of demand is not so great. So err on the side of integrity rather than trying to chase temporary profits. I don't know, would you agree with that?
Totally agree. And I think this is somewhere that the firms need to be very, very careful of. And I would totally agree with you that the side of that risk to focus on would be the lower risk element, i.e. don't damage relationships. You know, that may mean you can't turn around the work as quickly. That may mean that you can't do all of the work, but that's an easier conversation to have with people than potentially trying to put a price up, that being perceived in the wrong way and causing that reputation. And I guess it's all about developing the skills to have those sort of conversations, which I guess is the sort of thing we would be talking about on the 2-day public UK200 training courses later this year. But if you do want to pick up the phone and speak to either of us about how you might have those sort of conversations, we can try and give you a few hints and tips in the meantime. So we've talked there about some of the busier teams. Any other thoughts on any other practice areas or potentially client segmentation?
Again, it's a difficult area. I think that we've probably covered practice area segmentation in our last section. Client segmentation is something, though, that comes back to something that we work on quite hard in our masterclasses, Andy, which is trying to get away from the one-size-fits-all approach to pricing, that there's a price for a job. Think about it now. Think about the vast array of client experiences that will be out there. Many UK 200 firms will have clients that are engaging in mass redundancy programs, furloughing, looking for loans, etc. Yet at the other extreme, we'll have clients that are taking on extra staff to cope with demand. It would be nonsensical to price the two in the same way. We have to be able to tailor our pricing to the clients who are on their uppers and those that are experiencing unprecedented booms. So again, it needs a nuanced approach. It needs firms to have the skills to be able to treat clients differently, even though the job is fundamentally the same. But it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that firms need to rise to.
Yeah. As we say, price every job, every client, every time, and have that individual approach, thinking about it rather than those standards. We talked about teams that are in high demand. There's a difference generally between that high demand because they want something in terms of the client coming to a law firm or an accounting firm and saying, I'd like you to do this, and it all comes at the same time. And there's a difference between that and actual genuine urgency from the client saying, I need this and I need it now. Yeah. So if that is the case, is there a slight difference of approach there?
More than a slight difference, Andy. You know, where clients are saying, and where I've seen it a lot with my clients over the last 3 or 4 weeks has been on wills, sadly. And some people have had a genuine reason for urgency in wills, not just the typical, I've been meaning to do this for 20 years, but we're going on holiday next Friday scenario that many private client lawyers will be familiar with. But some have had genuine reasons for urgency. Now, in an era of high demand for wills and estate planning, if a client wants to jump to the front of the queue and inconvenience others by doing so, it's not only appropriate that urgency should be charged out as a premium, but it's the right thing to do. So clients, again, should be given the choice. If you really want this turned around in today or X days, then our price goes from here to here. But if you're content to take your place in the queue, and we'll probably get round to your will or getting round to execution in maybe 3 weeks, the price is down here. It's absolutely right, because otherwise all the long-standing loyal clients of the firm are getting their work pushed back through no fault of their own. So yeah, we should always charge a premium for urgency, or at least give the clients the choice. Would you like to pay this premium to have it done now, or are you content to take your place in the queue?
Yeah, and I think that's the right way to put it across. It's to put it across with that choice. So we're thinking we can do it by then, but it's going to cause these implications, in which case we would need to charge a premium for that. Do you really need it then? In which case it's this price. If not, if you're happy to wait, it's this price. And I think those same considerations, if you have the sensitive conversations, should apply. And it's not just in the wills examples you've given there in the legal side. There's also the similar issues within accountancy firms where clients are coming to accountancy firms saying, I need this and I need this now. And that right now may well be to obtain funding. It may well be to obtain a grant. It may well be to have a cash flow forecast prepared in order to be able to determine whether they're furloughing staff, for example. So there's lots of things where if a client demands a response that is out of the ordinary in terms of a response rate, then we start to think along those lines. Just moving on in terms of a stepping up from that micro level up to potentially a little bit more of a macro level, on a strategic front, thinking about the advice to give to leadership teams of law firms in terms of setting pricing guidelines, etc. I'd like a little bit further thought on discounting, but because you've mentioned it a couple of times already. But actually, this time of year, many law firms, accounting firms, they have their year ends. It's a typical time for reviewing charge out rates, and it's a typical time for potentially, usually, increasing charge out rates. Now, what would your views be for the leaders of professional firms in terms of reviewing those charge out rates, but not just reviewing whether they should be going up now, but also how that's communicated to clients?
Gosh, that's a good question, and a big one. Well, let's look at what we're facing. What we're facing at the moment is a demand crisis. It's not a cost crisis, certainly from the service firms angle. So I wouldn't see any overwhelming strategic reason to postpone any annual review of charge out rates, nor would I say thou shalt not increase rates during a crisis. I recall when I was in private practice and trying to cope with the GFC, one of the levers we pulled quite early on was a 10% increase in charge out rates. If 20% of our work's fallen off a cliff, the least we can do is try and charge a bit more for what's left. So I don't think there's any moral or strategic objection to reviewing charge out rates or increasing them. There is, of course, going to be some skill in communicating those increases to clients, and we've touched on that already. So this is probably not the time to be looking for the more ambitious increases of the kind that we saw some years ago and have come back on the radar recently. So it's about communication, but it's a relatively easy message. Law firms' costs will have been increasing. So we should be able to justify at least inflation level increases and possibly a bit more. After all, there's a higher degree of wage inflation in the law than there is on the other variable costs. So that's one aspect of your question, Andy. I think that's perfectly fine to look at charge out rates at the moment. In terms of the more strategic approach to pricing, you could look at, of course, at doing exactly the opposite and reducing your prices to stimulate demand, particularly in those areas for accountants and lawyers that aren't quite so busy at the moment. Query how effective that's going to be when, for example, let's take residential conveyancing as an example. I'm not sure that reducing prices substantially there is going to do much for demand when the obstacles about viewing properties, etc., are in place. But there might be other areas, sort of discretionary spend areas like commercial contracts. You can probably think of some examples from accountancy, Andy, where firms might want to get their keep their fee earners busy and kind of incentivize client demand by reducing prices. I think that's a difficult one. Probably something I wouldn't recommend leaders to go and explore. I think a better way of responding to any demand for reduced prices would be to offer added value rather than reduce prices. No, we can't give you 10% off that, but we could do X, Y, Z for you as well. It might be webinars of this kind. So I prefer to look at added value than discounting to stimulate demand. But the other thing that occurs to me in terms of what I'd be doing in a leadership position now is something that might go against the grain for a lot of professionals. Professionals value their autonomy in firms almost above all else. And we have to recognize that at a time like this, anxiety about our positions goes across the spectrum from trainees, newly qualified support staff, all the way up to equity partners. It's not hard to imagine that the interests of our fee earners diverge quite substantially from the best interests of the firm. What we can't afford at a time like this is for autonomy around pricing to descend into anarchy around pricing and individual fee earners giving crazy discounts and crazy incentives. So those firms that don't have well-established, quite tight strategic approaches to pricing from a governance perspective, from a policy perspective, now is the time to deal with that. I think it is time for most firms to centralise the control around pricing.
Yeah, and I would agree. You know, now is all about strong leadership, and this is just one part of that, and making sure that everybody is moving forward together in the same way in a consistent method. So we haven't got people giving discounts over here, charge out rates increases over here, consistent communications with clients, and that does need to be controlled. So if firms are thinking about discounting to stimulate demand, and in the accountancy side, that may well extend to things such as, well, we don't want you to do our accounts or our audit now, but can you come back later in the year? Well, actually, everybody wants us to come back later in the year, and therefore there will be probably not enough time to be able to deal with everybody then. So some firms could consider giving a discount to do it now.
Yep.
Downside of that is actually you could have furloughed those staff. So would you bring them back for work you're doing anyway, not furlough them just to keep them busy and give a discount? Potentially not. So that's why these decisions probably need to be made at a senior level.
Yes.
And any discounting needs to be agreed and signed off. Any increase in charge out rates need to be agreed centrally and signed off, but also the communication method is absolutely vital here. I think if we are looking to do any of this, for example, increase in rates, and we communicate that to clients, let's say in writing or in an email, that's not going to go down well. They're going to be receiving that going, how dare you increase your charges at this particular point in time when I'm suffering? That will stick. And I think generally my views for everybody in the professions, but also the wider world, as you go through issues like this, if you deal with things in the right way, you deal with people in the right way, you look after each other, you communicate in the right way, those added value things, those extra steps you've taken, the way you've dealt with things, the way you've communicated things will stick for the better, and you will bind those relationships together. Those that either try to take shortcuts or do things in the wrong way, that will also be remembered, and that will break the relationships once we come out of this. So I think we do need to take a lot of care, whatever we're doing, whether that's pricing related or anything else business or practice related at the moment. And that applies to not just clients, but that applies to our suppliers, and that applies to our people as well. So just looking at time, I think we're pretty much up against the time now. I'm hoping that everybody's found that useful in terms of taking forward some ideas in terms of how we price, how we interact with our teams, but also with our client base around pricing in the here and now. This will change, this will evolve. Practice areas will become busier, will become quieter as we go through this. We don't know exactly how we're going to be coming out of this or when we're going to be coming out of this. And therefore, I have a feeling that this, the influences on the pricing methods and choices will change as we go through this as well, and will certainly change when we come out the other end. But we will come out the other end, and I'm hoping that everybody stays safe and well, everybody's taking care. Thank you, Nigel, for taking part in this webinar this morning. Thank you to all of the UK200 member firms for tuning in. As I said earlier, if you've got any questions, then please do get in touch either centrally through UK200 or getting in touch with me directly, andy.poole@armstrongwatson.co.uk, or direct to Nigel if you want to ask any questions, if you need any help or support. We will be getting back in touch later in the year when we know we can see you face to face about the 2-day pricing sessions as well. So for now, thank you very much.
Thank you, goodbye.